our topic for today, the case against Columbus Day. Bum, bum, bum. It's still a federal holiday in, not so much in like the city of Los Angeles, I think was going to do away with it, and maybe in some other spots. But in general, that's coming up tomorrow, I believe. I think I timed this right. So we are on Columbus Day. And I don't know if you're still a big Columbus Day celebrator, then I apologize for the talk which will follow. But I think the good news is I think Columbus Day is sort of like Labor Day, right? Rarely do people go on strike on Labor Day. We just have a day off. And rarely do people go and colonize a new nation and send, collect slaves on their first day and send thousands home a couple years later. On Columbus Day, we just take a day off. So hopefully this won't offend any heartfelt sensitivities too desperately. Let's get into it. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Okay, good. That was my test, because I don't know how it's taught now, right? But back in my day, we had the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And then maybe there was another one I saw in some movie, a famous line. And the Nina, apparently the ships were all named for saints. This is what I just learned. So she was like Santa Barbara or something like that, actually, was who La Nina actually was in her real name. But then they all got nicknames. So that's just some trivia for you. So back in my day, we were taught about the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria in a way that implied good old Cristobal had what? Something to do with discovering a whole new world where democracy could be born. Is that similar to what you got? That's kind of what I got. I mean, despite, if you were lucky, more recently, they have a little piece about, well, Columbus probably wasn't the first discoverer. Leif Erikson came over hundreds of years before. And yet they still miss out on the fact that tens of thousands of years before, people walked across a land bridge in Siberia and then became indigenous to these lands before any of these fair-skinned folk showed up on their boats. Your assigned reading is an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. In case it's a hard reading. Come back to these hymns and meditations that we've done, but that's your assigned reading. And the author, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, I didn't write that down, so I hope I'm remembering it correctly. She'll often do, in her college classes, she'll do an opening exercise where she talks about, in 1776, draw a picture of the land that the rebels were fighting for. And without fail, her students all draw from sea to shining sea. This land is your land, this land, from California to the New York Island, right? It's such a good hippie song. And it's too bad that it also has unconscious manifest destiny woven into it. That's a real bummer that such a good song also has some really kind of toxic cultural mythos just unconsciously in there. I doubt that it's trying to put that in there. But this exercise, she then tells the students, well, no, there were just 13 colonies here, right? On the Atlantic sort of border. That's what they were fighting for. And the students go, oh, yeah. But she uses this to show how deeply ingrained these cultural mythos that this whole great northern half of a continent, basically, was destined to become the birthplace of democracy, a shining city upon the hill that could be a beacon to all other cultures and lands where we could go and, topple their dictators and fund guerrilla campaigns and things like that, so that democracy could spread around the world from its birthplace, United States of America. And this is an absolute fiction. It's an absolute fiction. Okay, you know that. I'll tell you why I'm calling attention to it in a second. Let me get through these notes. Come on. Okay. It didn't seem as important when I was learning this that Columbus never stepped foot on the thing we now call the United States. Right. I think some folks also have this vision that like this was in Florida or something. This was all in the Dominican Republic and the Bahamas and in that area. So this character who is like woven into our cultural mythos, we'll get to that in a second, never came to America in terms of the United States of America. It also didn't seem as important that he was sailing forth funded by Spanish Catholic monarchs. Right? Columbus, he was involved in planting the birthplace of democracy and discovering a whole new, unpeopled, fresh, virgin land so that democracy could be born, funded by royalty who wanted first a faster trip to the spice trade and maybe the slave trade as well, and then definitely wanted more places to put their slaves. And this was backed up by the Pope. And so what are the notes here? Don't get me all worked up. He had nothing to do with the English Puritans or their tax-averse revolutionary descendants. Really nothing to do. This guy was for church and monarch, sailing on down to Central and South America. And then we've got all of this other cultural mythos that gets attached to him, but it's not really related to this character at all. Columbus is a figure who didn't really have a lot to do with the United States as we know them, and yet his presence is felt deeply through many cultural institutions. Obviously, Columbus Day still exists, but I was surprised to learn this year, every year I learn a little bit more about Columbus Day, surprised to learn this year that our very capital, right, the District of Columbia, keep this in mind if you are a liberal voter, this is one of these liberal strategies to help rebalance the nation, is to try to get DC to be a state, because it's got a bigger population than many of our states, but it gets no voting rights. People live there. It's not as it was originally meant to be for our ruling class and their servants. It's not that anymore. I mean, kind of is. But if we're going to claim to be a democracy, DC might need to be an actual state. But anyway, District of Columbia. Doesn't that sound like it's a district of a South American nation? What? Because Colombia is this gal. This is Colombia. You may not have heard of her, but before Lady Liberty, for many years, until like the 1900s, Colombia was the feminine embodiment symbol of these United States of America. She was Colombia, and she was later replaced by Lady Liberty because she represented the explorer spirit and the discoverer that made liberty possible. But she's named after a slaver. Okay, Columbia was a feminine personification of America, whose job was later taken over by Lady Liberty, but whose influence remains. This is why we must have a case against Columbus Day. We Americans have finally reached a point in history where we are able to ask ourselves if this particular figure should be in the forefront of our cultural mythos. The facts of this mythic figure do not match up to the hard-won humanism of our current age. So a little bit about Columbus. On his first day in the New World, he ordered 6 of the native Taino people to be seized, writing in his journal that he believed they would be good servants. So this is day 1, right here. Thank God. Oh, you know, these people of color look like they would serve us well. Let's take them by force. That was day 1 of America as we know it. Later in his governorship of the Dominican Republic, he shipped thousands of Taino people back to Europe as slaves. So in case that first one didn't seem like enslavement enough, then there was actual put you on a boat, chattel slavery, off to Europe you go. Columbus's other terrible human rights affronts can be studied on your own, but it should be noted that his governance was so bad, even to European eyes, that he was eventually removed from office and forcibly shipped home. In this era of pandemic, we should also note that European settlers are likely responsible for introducing disease deaths that killed a greater percentage of Native American peoples than the Black Death killed of Europeans. So just for a little perspective. The spirit of discovery and exploration. Columbus is a symbol of exploration and the explorer's spirit because he ushered in the age of exploration in which Europeans began sailing the globe. But for our vision of history to be complete, we must understand that they sailed the globe because they were keen on the budding international slave trade. This is the main driver of what caused, the Portuguese learned routes up and down Africa, and then the Spanish had to keep up. And then we have Sir Francis Drake. He's got his own drive right in San Francisco that I drive past sometimes. Slave trader, great explorer, first to circumnavigate, I think. I read that the other day. I thought it was Magellan, but I think, so whoever it was, he was driving around to find new routes to take oppressed people in boats to force them to be laborers as property. They frantically began working to discover new routes and new lands of their own. So yes, Columbus is a symbol of the founding of our nation in that way, but with a tiny scratch beneath the propaganda, he's a symbol of everything wrong with it. The doctrine of discovery then and Christian nationalism now. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and then I made up this poem. In 1493, the doctrine of discovery. That's right, because we all learned in elementary school that then the Pope sent out a papal bull the next year that said, primarily to protect the new land holdings of the Spanish, that said that when you discover these lands, they are now yours, and other nations can't come and claim that they are theirs or something like that. So this is the doctrine of discovery, which had no thought to the original indigenous inhabitants of these lands. This set the ideological foundations for concepts like manifest destiny, which allowed European settlers to dehumanize the inhabitants of the land they wished to colonize, and thus commit atrocities without any sense of guilt or shame. And the list of atrocities is quite harsh. I won't recount them here on a Sunday morning, even though there is a sacredness in grieving the harsh reality. But I do invite you, if you have the stomach for it, to read this book, An Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States of America. And it just goes to show how effective this campaign of dehumanization really was. That with a sense of righteousness, with biblical verses to back it up, the most terrible war crimes you could imagine were perpetrated across many, many, many nations of people from sea to shining sea. And every October, we celebrate this with a day off in honor of the great discoverer of America, Christopher Columbus. This type of critical view of history, oh, there's that word, including critical views and theories of race, is very threatening to certain members of our American population. Some of them are knowingly continuing to benefit from the suffering of others, while others have merely been so propagandized by our cultural narrative that any attempts toward greater accuracy sound to them treasonous. In either case, it makes a very strong case against Columbus Day. Perhaps the only good thing that came out of the entirety of the Trump election campaign and election win is that it woke up so many well-meaning liberals of privilege to what oppressed populations of our country have been saying for a very long time. To oversimplify it, that a good portion of the American dream is about being a bully and getting away with it. Okay, why is this talk spiritual? This could have been a podcast. Why are we doing this on a Sunday morning? Well, because Unitarian Universalism is a spirituality of the worth and dignity of everyone. There's my image for that. It's about celebrating our interconnectedness. It's about engaging in democratic and egalitarian processes like those that our nation's founders learned from the Haudenosaunee people, more commonly known as the Iroquois Confederacy, who taught people like Benjamin Franklin about democracy. And so if we come to find that the bedrock of our nation is based in the very antithesis of these sacred principles, we must first wake ourselves up to it, and then we must do everything we can to rectify the situation, lest we be complicit in it. We're at a point in our history where we must make a choice. Will we unconsciously move forward from this harmful and outdated myth that downplays genocide? Or will we have the courage to give rise to something more human and caring? The fact is, though, it's not much of a choice. The old myth was not only based on bigotry, but on false information. It's a mythology of separatism and superiority that has nothing to do with how the world actually works. Our world is a dynamically complex and interconnected thing, and if we don't get up to date with that, we'll be constantly caught off guard by all of the challenges that are on their way. So if we are to celebrate Columbus Day, we should celebrate, you know, how they say, like, you'll celebrate the feast day of a saint. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's a party. Not all of the saints whose feasts you celebrate are party saints. If we're going to celebrate the day of Columbus, I believe that we should celebrate it with grief and mourning, both in our hearts and publicly. Collective mourning for the foul deeds of those who came before, and the power of that grief should stir us to act. Our actions can start with learning. To me, that seems so small. It's actually in the face of everything that we have to work for and everything that we have to work against. It seems small to say, let's do this. Let's spend a half hour on Sunday morning learning about history outside of a propagandized mythos. But learning and learning to teach is one of the most important acts that we can engage in. We must start with learning. We can see how crucial it is that we begin to change our cultural consciousness about things that have come to seem as innocuous as Columbus Day. When we've learned, we can begin to teach, and through teaching, we can participate in a process of awakening and atonement that should have begun long ago, but can at least begin now. So I'd like to offer you 3 practical practices. Well, that was a little redundant. I should have written notes for that. 3 practices that you can engage in as we go forth as your Columbus Day celebration. The first one is learn to regulate your nervous system and to help your friends regulate theirs, especially well-meaning modernists. Hopefully the recording of this came out. It'll go up on YouTube and you will be like, whoa, wait a minute. You've got to hear this. You got to hear this. This is amazing. And you might want to teach your friend who didn't get to do the singing and the being together and the breath work. You might want to teach them how to regulate their breath so that the first response, when shown the horrors of our own history, is not denial. Or the second response that the even more well-meaning folk do is we develop such an emotional response that then we center ourselves. Oh, these atrocities, and I'm going to cry about it on my Instagram account and never direct anyone toward actual activism or the voices of the same Indigenous people that we are lamenting having drowned out in the past. So first, learn to regulate your nervous system and that of your friends. Take your groundedness into the hard parts of history so that we may lance the boil and let it ultimately heal. Second, learn from real indigenous peoples. I have a job to do as a middle-aged white man, which is to start the process in case you hadn't heard it before, to make a YouTube video that might reach someone who never even thought to go to people who can tell you of their lived experience of being a marginalized or oppressed group in the United States of America, who claims to have as its founding principles equality and compassion. Don't learn from Native people. It has been told to me as if they were angels and could do no wrong and had all of the sacred secrets that the whites have lost and will reveal them to us, because that too is a type of dehumanization. But learn instead from people, neither dehumanizing toward savagery nor angelism, but learn from real life people. And finally, vote. There are some issues on California's ballot that different Native nations in California have weighed in on. You could look and see what they have to say about those issues on this ballot. But as well, while there's a lot of work to do to atone for and repair the tragedies of the past, I don't think we can do any of it without a functional democracy. Functional democracy is the opposite of the might is right paradigm that we can call colonialism. I urge you this November, not only to vote yourself, but to see if your friends in Texas are checking their voter status every day to make sure it hasn't disappeared. To see if your friends in Georgia know that there's an important Senate race, and to see if they align not only with the spoken values of the candidates, but the lived values and the example of their candidates. To see if your friends in Arizona want a Secretary of State who is pro-treasonous insurrection. And to ask these hard questions of ourselves and others, because without a functional democracy, it's a might is right paradigm, which is the very colonialism that we have to heal from. It comes down to whether we want to support bullies or whether we are anti-bully. As someone who is averse to polarization, I hate to make it so cut and dried, but those are your two choices. Do you want to support a paradigm and a cultural mythos that says who can beat up and commit war crimes has the power, makes the laws, and gets the special treatment? Or do you want a cultural paradigm that tries to put us all on equal ground and recognizes the inherent worth and dignity of everyone who comes to the table? Those are your two choices. And that's my case against Columbus Day. Thank you so much.